Hi, I'm Allie Jackson Jolly with Forbes. I'm here with Alfonso David, who is the president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum. He's also a civil rights attorney and who has done a lot of work not only around economic development, but also in advocating for the LGBTQ community. Alfonso, welcome and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I asked you here to talk a bit about Jesse Jackson, who passed away earlier this week. The late Reverend Jesse Jackson, often loved, definitely foundational, sometimes polarizing, um, but had a 60 plus year career around civil rights. What did you think when you heard that he had died earlier this week?
Well, first, condolences to his family is what I first thought about. And then I also thought about how his image and his legacy in some cases was limited to one prism. So Reverend Jesse Jackson was not only a civil rights activist, and I think for many people, they saw him through either that lens or through the lens of a presidential candidate. When I thought about his death and his passing, I thought about an architect of economic accountability who insisted that democracy has to function both in the marketplace as well as the ballot box. And thinking about his work through that lens is so important because I think, given some of the challenges we currently face, when we're thinking about economic accountability, when we're thinking about democracy, when we're thinking about equality in the workplace and the marketplace, Reverend Jackson's work really is core and central to that. So, in his passing, I hope we can recognize the breadth of work that he did in those areas and how he moved us forward in so many instances.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Looking at my notes, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the Rainbow Coalition, which of course was that idea that he launched during his presidential candidacy in 1984. Perhaps it was a idea before its time. It was really the idea of building multicultural coalition. Um, that wasn't really it feels very mainstream now, but that wasn't mainstream in the 80s. What do you think that he understood about economic power and political leverage that others at the time did not, and perhaps even some today still don't quite get?
So, as many people may know, Reverend Jackson worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And after Dr. King's death, untimely death, Reverend Jackson carried forward Dr. King's unfinished economic justice vision. So this idea, this belief that political rights without economic participation actually perpetuate inequality. And so he understood the importance of advancing the economic justice vision, but also understood that you can't successfully do that without building a coalition of people that are empowered and invested in realizing that vision. And so in the early 80s, in the 90s, when he was talking about the Rainbow Coalition, he was really talking about a structural realignment around jobs and labor and trade and economic fairness, and thinking about how do you build a multiracial coalition and reframe the idea of Black leadership as a governing force, not just a symbolic presence, but as a governing force. He ran twice for president, and he made economic justice the framework of his campaigns. But importantly, to the point that you made earlier, really thought about how do you do this successfully and how do you do this in a way that's sustainable? And the multiracial coalition idea that, to your point earlier, was not as popular when he raised it, I think is core and central to how people think about what the future could look like in a way that could be potentially sustainable.
Yeah, and what do you think? had you had any conversations with him around this? Um, and if you did, what did he say? And if you didn't specifically have conversations with him, what do you think he would have thought about where we are right now in 2026? Um, do you think that he was satisfied with some of the movement in communities of various, historically marginalized communities coming together and using their voice to create economic power for themselves?
So I did have a number of conversations with the Reverend Jackson at a variety of different events. And I can't say that I know conclusively what he would feel about this moment, but based on our conversations, based on what I know he was advancing through his work, he understood the importance of building coalition. He was not a solitary figure. His work was built around and alongside churches and labor unions and organizers and journalists and business leaders. So we all know instinctively that movements require a multitude of institutions and individuals to thrive. You may have charisma, and that may ignite momentum, but you need governance to actually sustain it. And as we're thinking about this moment, I think that we are in a regressive period, unfortunately, where a lot of the work that he did is being attacked. He solidified the path to economic mobility for Black people and Brown people and other marginalized communities. But I think one of the cautionary lessons is that progress is not permanent,
Mm.
that gains must be defended and institutionalized and audited. And economic inclusion cannot depend on goodwill alone. It actually requires infrastructure. So we're seeing our democratic infrastructure, our economic infrastructure be challenged in this moment. And I would suspect that he would lament about the work that we have been doing, the importance of continuing to do that work, and the challenges that we face ahead.
Yeah, and so I love that you talk about really wonky things like infrastructure, because you and I, in some of our former conversations, we've talked about how some of the real work, especially around economic access and mobility, a lot of that work is done in the margins, right? I work in the media, we live in this moment where like the big, salacious, or else like frothy stories get all the attention. Um, but what was the work that you saw Jesse Jackson doing that was sort of the smaller things, the day-to-day stuff that was sort of less exciting, less sexy in the margins, but that you think, are a real boon to where we are right now?
I think his genius, Reverend Jackson's genius, was translating moral urgency into economic leverage.
Mm,
So he recognized that Black consumers represented purchasing power. And he also understood that purchasing power could be organized. Now, of course, we know about Operation Breadbasket and all of those other
hmm
campaigns that he led over the years, and those got a lot of press. But what people may not know is the work that it took to actually get those operations operational,
mm,
to actually move those campaigns forward. Because he understood that if communities are good enough to buy from large companies, then they're also good enough to be hired by them. They're also good enough to own franchises within them, to
mhm,
supply them, to be governed by them. And a lot of that work was behind the scenes. A lot of that work was through negotiations. A lot of that work was negotiating and having conversations with large companies about the importance of diversification, right? So you may have read about Operation Breadbasket in Chicago, or read about the Coca-Cola campaign, or read about the 7-Up agreement that he did. And those were important landmark agreements that he achieved, but the work to get to those agreements, many people may not know about.
mm,
How he got to define employment goals, how he got to really think about reflecting the diversity of the consumer basis for large companies was important, really difficult work that many people just don't see because that's really the hard work to get to the glory.
Mm. And since I do work in a media landscape that loves a soundbite, if you had to distill the Reverend Jesse Jackson's legacy to one or two words, what would those be?
Reverend Jackson's legacy is not nostalgia. That's what I would say. It's a blueprint.
Hmm. Hmm.
Organize economic power. That is his legacy. Negotiate measurable commitments. Build coalitions broad enough to sustain reform.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
if we think about all of the work that he did, both in the private sector and within the public square, it was all about organizing economic power, negotiating measurable commitments, and really building coalitions that are broad enough to sustain the wins, to sustain the reforms. And we have a lot of work to do, but he was really insisting that inclusion be auditable, that we audit inclusion, that we're not just simply talking about diversification in an abstract form, that we're thinking about how do you audit success? How do you audit, whether or not people are actually being included in a way that's sustainable over time? And
Hmm.
I would say to me, that is the core of his legacy.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there anyone that you see in this next generation that's doing, who's going to pick up the gauntlet and do this next? Is there someone out there that I should know about or that this audience should know about who's doing this good work?
I think there's so many different people that are doing this work in their own way, whether we're talking about AOC in the political context or Bernie Sanders in the political context. Reverend Al Sharpton has been doing this work for quite some time. But then you have younger leaders that you may not know about, that we may not know their names, that are doing this work within large companies,
Mhm.
where it's in some ways a liability for their names to be highlighted by the media because it undermines their ability to achieve success within their large companies. And I know many of those folks. Some of them are CEOs of large companies, and some of them are chief diversity officers, and some of them are chief financial officers. And they're doing this work internal to their corporations, recognizing that they have to really confront the noise with the facts.
Mhm.
Make sure that folks understand how do you really define effective leadership through an inclusive lens? And how do you achieve economic justice in a way that's sustainable, in a safe environment? So there are many people that I think are still doing that work. I think as we move forward, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify one person
Mhm.
that we can say this person will take the mantle and run with it, in part because our landscape is constantly being redefined at a pace that is difficult for us to keep up with,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? You think about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and how the speed of information informed progress. That's very different today.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think because it's very different today, and because we live in an increasingly global economic culture and environment, the folks that are informing, affecting, and advancing economic justice are as diverse and varied as the work is that we have to do moving forward.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. So final question. What can you tell us? What can you plug about the Global Black Economic Forum? What's going on? Where can we follow you next?
So we're doing a fair amount of work on highlighting for business leaders the importance of standing up in this moment to authoritarian tactics that I think are going to affect the bottom line. And it's important that we connect the dots. What's happening in Minnesota, or happened, and in some cases is still continuing in Minnesota, what happened in Venezuela, actually is relevant to how companies will function. If your consumers are afraid to leave their homes, if your consumers can't leave their homes, it will affect your workforce as well as your consumer base. And we have to think holistically about how our political climate and infrastructure is going to affect the economic one.
Mhm.
So we're doing a lot of that work just to make sure that business leaders are attuned to these features and these factors that are going to affect economic mobility. We're also adequately preparing for our major festival in July, which we will be bringing in business leaders from across the globe to talk about some of the most pressing and complex issues that are affecting marginalized communities, whether or not we're talking about artificial intelligence in the healthcare space or we're talking about the impact of the healthcare changes that we're seeing with the most recent piece of legislation that was passed, to how do we really think about the future, the global economy, where there's so much changing for businesses who may be multinational corporations. So we're excited about that. We're going to be bringing on board a lot of really interesting speakers and talking about some really important issues that are going to affect the next few years.
Great. Well, now we are out of time. Alfonso, thank you so much for being with us again. And, hopefully we'll do this again soon.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.